I took a job as an overnight security guard at the hospital where my father died 8 months earlier, and I never told anyone why. The listing had been sitting on a job board for weeks. Overnight patrol, 3 nights on, 4 off, no experience required, will train. I read it maybe 40 times before I filled anything out. I told myself I was just curious about the schedule. I told myself I was between things and the pay was fine. I told myself a lot of things that fall. The truth is that I wanted to walk that hallway. I wanted to stand where I had stood at 4 in the morning, holding my father's hand while something down the corridor kept chiming and nobody came, and I wanted to see it with the lights on and my head clear. I don't know what I expected to find. I just knew I couldn't stop thinking about a red light above a doorway, and I thought that maybe if I saw it enough times, it would stop meaning what it meant. My father was 71. He went in for something small. A blocked bile duct, a routine procedure, in and out in 2 days. That's what they told us. He was cracking jokes with the intake nurse. He asked her if the gown came in his size, or if he was going to have to hold it shut with dignity alone. She laughed. He was that kind of man. He made strangers feel like they'd known him a long time. He developed a complication on the second night. It happens. I understand that now better than I ever wanted to. His pressure started dropping and he was in pain, and he pressed his call button. Nothing happened. He pressed it again. My mother was asleep in the chair beside him and he didn't want to wake her, so he just kept pressing the button and waiting. The light above his door was on for 41 minutes. I know it was 41 because it's in the record. That number is the most familiar fact in my life. When someone tells me an address or a price, my brain checks it against 41 first, just out of habit. 41 minutes is nothing in a normal life. You can lose 41 minutes looking at your phone. 41 minutes was also the entire distance between my father being a man who was going home on Thursday and my father being a man who was not. They responded eventually. They did everything right once they got there, I'm told, and I have no reason to doubt it. It just didn't matter by then. The hospital's letter to my mother said they had conducted an internal review and found that the standard of care had been met. That's the phrase. The standard of care had been met. I read that sentence so many times the words came apart in my hands. We asked for a meeting. We got a conference room with 2 administrators in it and a box of tissues already sitting on the table, which I remember thinking was strange, like they knew what the room was for. They were sorry for our loss. They were unable to discuss personnel matters. They said unforeseeable and unfortunate and already reviewed. My mother thanked them because she is a polite woman and because she was destroyed, and we walked out to the parking garage and she cried in the car and I did not. I didn't cry for 8 months. I applied for the job instead. Orientation took 2 days. They gave me a radio and a windbreaker and a badge, and a supervisor named Wendell walked me through the campus map and taught me how to check a door. Wendell had been doing this 19 years. He had the calmest voice I have ever heard on a human being. He said the whole job could be described in one sentence. Be where people can find you. They assigned me to the tower. Floors 4 through 7, midnight to 8. My father died on 6. I want to be honest about this, because I've had a long time to think about what I was actually doing. I did not go in there with a plan. I wasn't building a case. I just had this feeling like a stone in my shoe, and I thought that if I stood in that hallway enough nights, the stone would work its way out. That was before I met her. My first shift, I came up the stairwell at 10 past midnight and pushed through the doors onto 6, and the smell hit me. Nobody warns you about that. The sanitizer and the linen and the faint metal underneath it. My body remembered before my mind did. I had to stand there with my hand on the doorframe. A woman at the station looked up from a clipboard. She said, "You must be the new one." I said I was. She came around the counter and put out her hand and told me her name. She said everybody just called her Margie. She said she'd been on this floor 16 years, and if I ever needed the code to the supply closet or a decent cup of coffee at 3 in the morning, she was the person to ask. I shook her hand. I want you to understand something. I had never seen her face. My father died at 4 in the morning on a Tuesday, and the people in the room at the end were strangers in blue, And afterward, there were papers and phone calls and a funeral, and at no point did anyone sit us down and say, "Here is the nurse who was assigned to him that night." We only had the record. The record had a name in it, and I had read that name until it stopped being letters. It was hers. She was standing there smiling at me with her hand out, telling me where to find the good coffee. And I said, "Nice to meet you. I don't know why." I've thought about it 100 times. I think I said it because a hand was out and my hand went into it, and that's what a body does. I think I said it because I was so completely unprepared for her to be a real woman with a real face and a lanyard covered in little enamel pins. She said, "You'll get used to the nights. It's the days that'll kill you." Then she went back to her clipboard. I walked the rest of my patrol without registering a single thing I saw. I checked doors I don't remember checking. At 4 in the morning, I found myself standing outside room 614 with no memory of walking there. I didn't tell anyone who I was. I made that decision in the stairwell on the first night, and then I made it again every night after, hundreds of times. I told myself I wanted to observe. I told myself I wanted to see how the floor really ran when nobody was performing for a family. Some of that was even true. For 11 weeks I worked that floor, and I watched her. Here is what I expected to see. I expected a woman who didn't care. I had built her in my head over 8 months, and the woman I built was cold and lazy and a little cruel. I had given her a bored face. I had pictured her at the station with her feet up while a light burned red above my father's door. That is not what I saw. What I saw was a woman who ran. Not a metaphor. She physically ran in soft shoes up and down that corridor all night, every night. I saw her hold a dying man's hand for 20 minutes at 3 in the morning because his family lived out of state and hadn't made it yet. I saw her sing to a woman with dementia who was screaming for her mother. I saw her mop a floor herself because housekeeping was 2 hours out and someone might slip. I saw a man detoxing in 11 call her a word I won't repeat, and I saw her come back 40 minutes later with a warm blanket for him. I watched a person be good at a job over and over in the dark for no audience, and it made me so angry I could barely stand up straight, because I needed her to be a monster. That was the arrangement I had with myself. If she was a monster, then my father died because a monster was in the building, and monsters can be removed. If she wasn't a monster, then he died for some other reason, and I didn't know what it was yet, and not knowing was worse. So I stopped watching her and started watching the floor. There were supposed to be 4 nurses on 6 at night. Some nights there were 3. One night in November there were 2, for the entire shift, for 31 patients. I know because I counted. I started counting everything. The call lights came on and stayed on. Not sometimes. Constantly. The board at the station lit up like a switchboard and stayed lit, and the nurses moved through it triaging in their heads. This one's a water refill. This one's real. This one's the man in 9 who presses it every 10 minutes for company. And then there was the sound. A chime went with the lights, and past a certain volume it turned into a wall of noise you stopped being able to hear. I stopped hearing it myself by week 3, and I was only walking through. One night, I caught myself standing at the station having a completely normal conversation about parking rates while 3 lights burned above 3 doors and something chimed behind us and neither of us reacted at all. That was the night I understood what happened to my father. I looked into the alarm system, not in any sophisticated way. I typed the model number off the panel into a search bar at 4 in the morning and read what came back. The system had a documented flaw. When the number of simultaneous calls crossed a threshold, the audible alert stopped escalating. The light stayed on, but the sound stopped nagging. There was a manufacturer advisory. It recommended a firmware update, and if the update wasn't feasible, a manual escalation policy, meaning a human being physically walking the board every 15 minutes. I checked the panel. The firmware was 2 versions behind. So on the night my father was dying, the light above his door was on, and the sound that was supposed to make somebody look up had already dissolved into every other sound, and there was no rule requiring anyone to walk the board. I looked for the manual escalation policy in the unit binder. There wasn't one, and there were 3 nurses for 31 people, and one of them was down the hall with another man who was also dying. And my father pressed a button and waited. It isn't a monster. It's so much worse than a monster you can fire. I want to tell you I handled this well. I did not. I went home that morning and sat in my own driveway until the sun was all the way up, and then I went inside and put my fist through a closet door, which accomplished nothing except that I now had a hole in a door and a bad hand, and I lied to my mother about both. The thing that broke was small. It was a Thursday in early December. There'd been a coat on the floor, and afterward, Margie was standing at the station with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands, shaking. Not crying. Just shaking, the way you shake when the adrenaline leaves. She said, mostly to herself, I can't keep doing this. And I said, before I knew I was going to say it, did you ever miss one? She turned and looked at me. I said, a light. Did you ever miss one? I have replayed her face at that moment more times than I can count. She didn't get defensive. She didn't ask what I meant. Something in her went very still, and she said, quietly, once. She said, a man on this floor. It was a bad night. We were down 2, and I was in a room and the board was full and I didn't walk it. And when I got there, it had been on a long time, and he died. She said, I think about it every single night I work. And I said, his name was Thomas. The coffee cup went down on the counter. She didn't set it down. It just went down. I said, he was my father. I'm his son. I've been on this for 11 weeks and I never told you. I remember the ice machine somewhere behind the station. I remember a monitor beeping in a room. She didn't say anything for a long time. Her mouth moved twice with nothing coming out of it. Then she sat down. Not gracefully. She sort of arrived in the chair. She said, I'm so sorry. And then she said the thing I have never gotten out of my head. She said, please don't tell me I did everything I could. I've had people say that and I can't hear it again. I didn't tell her that. I stood in that hallway with the woman I had spent 8 months hating, and she was gray in the face and gripping the arms of a rolling chair, and I felt none of the things I had prepared to feel. There was no triumph in it. There wasn't even relief. There was a hallway and 2 exhausted people, and a light on above a door in 11 that neither of us had gotten to yet. She asked me what I wanted. I said I didn't know. That was the truest thing I said all year. I told Wendell the next morning. Everything. He listened without interrupting once, and when I finished he was quiet a while, and then he said, son, you should not have been on that floor. Not because you did anything wrong. Because nobody should have to do what you've been doing. He walked me down to patient safety himself. I was pulled off the tower that day, reassigned to the parking structures, pending review, which was the right call, and I said so. I expected to be fired. I had put myself in a patient care area under a conflict I never disclosed, and I said that out loud in the meeting before anyone else could. They didn't fire me. What they did was open a file. The patient safety officer was a woman named Ada Yez, who had a way of asking a question and then just waiting, without filling the silence, until you'd said more than you meant to. I gave her everything. The counts I'd made, the staffing on the nights I'd worked, the panel model number and the manufacturer advisory and the firmware version. The empty section in the binder where an escalation policy should have been. She asked why I'd kept notes. I said I hadn't known why at the time. I said I'd been looking for a person to blame and found a system instead, and I didn't know what to do with that, so I wrote it all down. She said, that's usually how it goes. They opened a formal review. Then the state came in, because the hospital was required to report it once it was properly characterized, and it had not been properly characterized the first time. That was the finding that mattered most. The original internal review, the one that produced the letter to my mother, had been done in 6 days by 2 people, one of whom reported to the nursing director of that unit. It looked at the actions of one nurse on one night. It never looked at the panel. It never looked at the staffing grid. It never asked why a light could burn for 41 minutes without a sound anybody heard. The standard of care had been met. That was true in the narrow way they asked the question. The problem was the question. The surveyors were on site 9 days. Margie gave a statement, and I want to say this plainly, because it matters. She did not minimize a single thing. She could have. She had a representative sitting beside her who advised her more than once to say less. She said more instead. She said she had not walked the board. She said she should have. She said the staff had been silencing the audible alerts at the panel on busy nights, because everyone did, because the noise made it impossible to think, and that it had been going on for years, and supervisors knew and had never stopped it. That admission is what cracked the thing open. She knew it would come back on her. She said it anyway. She was disciplined. A formal reprimand, remedial training, 6 months of monitored practice. She kept her license. I have opinions about whether that was enough, and they changed depending on the day and the hour and how much I've slept. The nursing director resigned before the findings were published. The hospital was cited for failure to maintain a functioning alert escalation process, for staffing below its own written policy on 11 documented nights, and for an inadequate initial investigation. They paid a fine. I've seen the number. It's less than what they spend on landscaping, but the other things stuck. The firmware was updated within a week of the surveyors leaving, which tells you it was always a week's worth of work. They installed a secondary escalation so that any call light burning longer than 10 minutes now triggers a separate alarm and pages the charge nurse directly, and it cannot be silenced from the panel. Somebody physically walks that board every 15 minutes now and initials a sheet, and the sheet gets audited. They changed how reviews get done, too. Nobody reviews their own unit anymore. There's an outside reviewer on every serious event, and the family hears the finding from a person whose job is not to protect the building. That last one is not a small thing. That one came straight out of a conference room with a box of tissues already on the table. I sat down with my mother in her kitchen and told her all of it, including the part where I took a job under her nose and lied to her about my hand, and spent 8 months hating a woman who had been thinking about my father every night of her life. She was quiet a long time. Then she said, "Did she cry?" I said, "Yes." And my mother said, "Good." And then she put her face in her hands and said, "That's an awful thing to say." And I said, "No, it isn't." And we sat there. She asked me later if I felt better. I told her the truth, which is that better isn't the word. Nothing about this made my father less dead. What I feel is that the thing that killed him is smaller now than it was. It's still in that building. It's in every building like it. But it's smaller, and there are 100 people upstairs right now who will press a button and have someone come, and they will never know anything was ever wrong. That is the only kind of justice this particular thing had available. I don't work there anymore. I took a job with the state eventually, in the office that handles facility complaints. I read letters from families all day. I'm the person on the other end of the number now. I saw Margie once more, almost a year later, at a public hearing on staffing ratios. She testified. I hadn't known she'd be there. She talked about the board and the lights and the noise, and she said a thing I've thought about ever since. She said the hardest part of the job is not the work. It's choosing which person you're going to fail tonight, and knowing you'll never be told whether you chose right until it's much too late. She saw me on the way out. We stood in the hallway, and neither of us knew what to do with our hands. She asked how my mother was. I said better than she was. She said, "I still think about him." And I said, "I know. That's why I stopped." That's the whole conversation. Maybe 40 seconds. We didn't hug. We didn't forgive each other, because I'm not sure either of us had the standing to forgive anything. She went to get her car, and I went to get mine, and I sat in the parking lot for a while, the way I do. I don't hate her. It took a long time to be able to say that and mean it, and there are still nights when I don't. Grief doesn't move in one direction. It goes wherever it wants, and you follow it around. But I know now what I was really doing on that floor, all those nights, walking a corridor and checking doors that didn't need checking. I was waiting for someone to come. I got tired of waiting, so I went and got them myself.